Asher was 37 years old and lived alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of a northern forest. The cabin was modest, built years earlier with practicality in mind, not comfort. One main room, a small kitchen corner, and a wood stove that worked hard through the winter months. It was enough for him. He had chosen the place because it was quiet and far from unnecessary noise. Winter had settled in deeply. Snow lay thick on the ground, packed hard by weeks of freezing temperatures. The trees surrounding the cabin stood bare and still, their branches creaking softly when the wind moved through them. Nights were long and cold, the kind that demanded routine and discipline just to get through them. Asher's days followed a simple pattern. He woke early, tended the fire, prepared plain meals, and worked small jobs that kept the cabin maintained. When daylight allowed, he walked the edge of the forest to check for fallen branches or signs of animals moving through the snow. He didn't linger. The cold discouraged wandering thoughts. There was no dramatic reason behind his life there. No escape, no tragedy he spoke of. He preferred things uncomplicated. Solitude suited him. Silence made the days predictable, and predictability brought a sense of control. At night, he locked the door, fed the fire once more, and settled into stillness. The forest beyond the cabin faded into darkness, becoming only shapes and shadows behind the frost-covered windows. Asher was used to that darkness. It had become part of his routine, as familiar as the sound of the wind brushing against the walls. Nothing about that night suggested it would be any different. The sound came before dawn. In that quiet stretch of time when night has not yet loosened its grip, Asher was awake, lying still beneath a heavy blanket, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. The fire had burned low, leaving the room cold enough to sting the lungs with each breath. Then something struck the door. It was not a knock. There was no rhythm to it, no intention. The sound was dull and heavy, followed by a low scrape, as if something had slid down the wood. The cabin settled back into silence, but it felt altered, as though the air itself had tightened. Asher sat up slowly. His first thought was of a fallen tree limb or drifting snow, but the weight of the sound did not match either. It had carried effort behind it. Strain. He listened again, heart steady but alert. Another noise followed, softer this time. A long exhale. Almost a breath. He reached for his boots and pulled them on without rushing. Years in the forest had taught him that panic led to mistakes. He stood, took the flashlight from the hook near the door, and paused. The darkness outside pressed against the thin walls, complete and absolute. Asher moved closer to the door, careful with each step. The floorboards creaked under his weight, loud in the quiet cabin. He placed his hand against the wood. It was cold, colder than it should have been, as if the night had settled heavily on the other side. Something shifted again, right outside. This time, there was no mistaking it. Whatever stood beyond the door was alive, struggling to remain upright. Asher tightened his grip on the flashlight and leaned in, listening. He did not open the door yet. Not until he understood what was waiting for him on the other side. When Asher finally opened the door, the sight that met him froze him in place. A massive figure pressed against the wood, her dark fur matted with frost, breathing shallow and uneven. The creature was not moving with purpose, not aggressive, not threatening. She was simply spent, exhausted to the edge of collapse. Clutched in her large, trembling arms were 4 tiny forms, wrapped in what looked like layers of leaves and scraps of fur. The babies were still unnervingly so, their small bodies rigid in the cold. Asher's heart tightened at the sight. There was no malice here, no hunger, no intent to harm. Only a raw, desperate need for warmth and survival. The mother lifted her head slightly, amber eyes dim but aware. A low, almost human sigh escaped her lips, carrying more pleading than any cry could convey. She seemed to search for safety, for protection, and in that instant, Asher understood that she had placed her trust entirely in whoever might answer the door. The babies, though silent, radiated fragility. He could see the frost clinging to their fur, see the way their tiny chests barely rose with each shallow breath. Asher felt the weight of responsibility press on him as heavily as the cold pressing against the cabin. Every instinct screamed caution, but every ounce of empathy pushed him forward. He remained still, taking in every detail. The mother's posture was protective, curling slightly around her young, yet she did not resist as Asher stepped closer. There was a rhythm to her breathing, a fragile pulse, and he knew that if he acted too quickly or harshly, he could shatter the trust that had brought her here. The forest beyond the cabin seemed to hold its breath as well. Even the wind had softened, as though waiting for the next moment. Asher's eyes moved from mother to infants and back, absorbing the reality of the scene. This was not a story he could easily tell anyone. It was too real, too raw. And yet, in the quiet of that early morning, he knew there was only one choice to make. He inhaled slowly, preparing himself. He would help. That much was clear. The rest would have to unfold with patience and care. The Mother Bigfoot leaned heavily against the doorframe, her weight almost entirely supported by Asher as he moved closer. She was barely conscious, her head lolling slightly to one side, eyes half closed and glazed. Frost clung to her thick fur in icy patches, especially around her shoulders and arms. Evidence of long exposure to the harsh winter night. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, a soft rasp that echoed in the quiet cabin. Each exhale carried effort, a struggle that spoke of exhaustion far beyond anything Asher had ever witnessed. She made no sound beyond the occasional low groan, and it was clear that even the smallest movement required concentration and energy. She no longer had to spare. The infants in her arms were even more fragile. Their tiny bodies shivered despite being bundled in layers of leaves and fur. Their breaths were shallow, some barely noticeable, and their small faces were pinched from cold. The frost on their fur glimmered faintly in the weak light, a stark reminder of the danger they were in. Asher could feel the immediate urgency pressing down on him. Every second mattered. He studied the mother carefully. There was no threat in her posture, no panic beyond what her exhaustion naturally conveyed. This was not an attack or an intrusion. This was the final act of a mother's desperate attempt to save her children. Her presence on his doorstep, in this vulnerable state, was a plea, silent yet unmistakable. Asher understood the weight of the moment. He was now the one chance these lives had to survive. His instincts told him to act slowly but deliberately. One wrong movement could worsen the mother's condition or harm the babies. Yet standing still was no longer an option. He reached a quiet decision, locking his focus on the task ahead. There would be no hesitation. Every action needed to be measured, gentle, and intentional. For this mother and her 4 tiny frozen children, there was no other hope. Only his hands, his warmth, and his calm could bridge the distance between life and loss. For a moment, fear flickered through Asher's mind. The figure before him was enormous, unlike anything he had ever encountered so closely. His heart quickened, the rational part of his brain warning him to step back, to call for help, to be cautious. Yet the sight of the mother and her frozen infant stripped away every thought of self-preservation. Instinct took over. Empathy, urgent and undeniable, pushed aside hesitation. There was no time for reasoning, no space for doubt. The mother's fragile breathing, the quiet shivers of the babies demanded action now. Words were unnecessary. Panic would do nothing. Silence and care were the only tools that mattered. Asher's hands moved naturally, almost automatically, as he shifted the weight of the door and opened it wider. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, ensuring he did not startle her. The cold air rushed in, but it was no longer an obstacle. It was the bridge between them. The moment where he became the conduit for life and warmth. He did not speak. He did not hesitate. His focus narrowed entirely to the task: help them survive. Every ounce of his attention was on the mother, on the babies, on creating a safe space within the cabin. Fear had receded, replaced by clarity, calm, and the unwavering drive to act. This single wordless decision would define the rest of the night. In that instant, Asher's role was no longer that of a solitary man living quietly at the forest edge. He was the only chance for 4 small lives and their exhausted mother. And he would not fail them. Asher moved with careful precision, every step measured so as not to startle the exhausted creature before him. He grabbed a few logs from the small stack near the stove and arranged them in the firebox. Striking a match, he coaxed the fire to life, the first sparks hissing and flaring as the wood caught. The warmth began to fill the cabin slowly, pushing back the chill that clung stubbornly to the corners. He turned back to the Mother Bigfoot. She remained where she had collapsed, her massive form trembling slightly from cold and fatigue. Asher extended a steady hand, speaking softly in tones he knew she could not understand, but might feel in the calm of his presence. Slowly, deliberately, he guided her toward the cabin's interior. Each movement was gentle, reassuring, conveying that she was no longer alone in the world outside. The babies, bundled tightly against her, did not stir. Their tiny faces peeked from the layers of fur and leaves, delicate as snowflakes, and Asher felt the sharp pang of urgency to get them warmed. Once the mother was positioned near the fire, he carefully eased each infant into a small nest of blankets he had quickly prepared on the floor. He worked methodically, mindful of their fragility, making sure the heat from the fire would reach them without overwhelming them. Throughout the process, the mother did not resist. She allowed Asher's hands to steady her, allowed him to place her babies near warmth, and stayed remarkably calm despite her exhaustion. In her eyes, there was a quiet acknowledgement, a trust placed wholly in this human who had opened his home without hesitation. As the fire crackled and cast gentle shadows across the cabin walls, Asher remained still, giving her space while remaining present. There were no sudden movements, no loud words, only the steady heat of the fire and the soft rhythm of his hands guiding, supporting, and protecting. In that moment, the cabin became a sanctuary for the Mother Bigfoot and her 4 tiny children. It was the first safety they had known in the frozen night. Asher knelt by the small pile of blankets where the 4 infants lay, moving deliberately and with extreme care. Each tiny body was cold to the touch, the frost clinging stubbornly to their fur. He wrapped them individually in soft layers, rubbing gently to encourage circulation, careful not to jostle them too much. His movements were precise, patient, almost ceremonial, every action intended to coax warmth back into fragile limbs without causing harm. The fire crackled nearby, sending gentle heat across the cabin. Asher positioned the babies so that the warmth would reach them evenly, alternating slight adjustments between them, monitoring the faint rise and fall of each chest. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the subtle signs of life began to return. A finger twitched. A small sigh escaped one of the infants. Another shifted slightly, a tiny shiver giving way to a soft pulse of movement. Each small indication brought a cautious sense of relief, though he remained quiet, knowing that sudden noise or haste could undo progress. The Mother Bigfoot stayed close, propped lightly against the wall. Despite her exhaustion, she observed every gesture, her amber eyes following the careful motions of Asher's hands. She did not interfere, but her gaze expressed something deeper than understanding trust. She seemed aware that this human had become the bridge between her children's peril and their survival. Even weak, even worn down, she remained vigilant, her presence steadying the space around them. Asher worked without pause, breathing steadily, keeping his movements calm and predictable. Time stretched slowly, measured only by the tiny movements and responses of the babies. He spoke rarely, only in soft murmurs that were more instinct than communication, words meant to soothe both the mother and the infants. Every second counted. Every careful motion, a lifeline. By the time the first rays of light began to pierce the cabin window, the smallest of the babies had started to stir more noticeably. A tiny whimper, a shiver that gave way to warmth. The mother's eyes softened slightly, a faint shift in posture, as if she knew the tide had turned in favor of life. Asher stayed vigilant, methodical, and patient, understanding that his steady hands and quiet presence had become the anchor in a night that could have been lost to the cold. The hours stretched on with agonizing slowness. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling loose shingles and stirring the snow into small drifts. But inside, time seemed measured only by the slow rise and fall of tiny chests. Asher remained alert, seated near the fire, his body tense yet calm, eyes flicking from the mother to the infants and back again. The Mother Bigfoot stayed where he had guided her, curled lightly against the wall, her eyes half closed but never fully surrendering to sleep. Each shallow breath she took was deliberate, measured, as if even rest required vigilance. She remained aware, scanning the cabin in silent acknowledgement of Asher's presence. A quiet sentinel despite her weakness. The infants lay nestled in the blankets, their small limbs wrapped tightly, their bodies still fragile from the cold. Each breath was faint, sometimes barely perceptible, but consistent enough to signal life. Asher watched them carefully, adjusting the blankets when needed, letting the heat from the fire reach each one evenly. He moved slowly, speaking only in whispers when he could not help it, knowing that sudden sounds or movements could disturb the fragile balance of warmth and life. Minutes felt like hours. The fire's light flickered across the walls, shadows dancing softly as he shifted from one infant to another, ensuring that none were neglected, none left vulnerable. He resisted the urge to drift off himself. The responsibility was too heavy, the margin for error too small. Every sound outside, every gust of wind, drew his attention, but he did not allow fear to distract him from the steady rhythm of care. Though exhaustion pressed at him, Asher remained vigilant. The mother sensed his constancy, occasionally raising her head to glance at him with a quiet understanding. No words were exchanged. There was no need. In that long, sleepless night, trust and care passed between them, silent and complete. As the first fragile signs of life began to strengthen in the dim, warming cabin, the first pale light of dawn seeped through the frost-lined window panes, softening the cabin's interior with a gentle glow. It was a quiet illumination, not harsh or startling, but enough to show the subtle changes that had occurred over the long, tense night. The infants began to stir. Tiny movements, at first a twitch of a finger, a small shift in a shoulder, but enough to signal that warmth and life were returning. Asher leaned forward slightly, careful not to interrupt the fragile rhythm, watching as each little chest rose and fell with slightly more confidence. A faint sigh, a small murmur of breath, confirmed what he had hoped all along. They were beginning to pull through. The Mother Bigfoot lifted her head slowly, her amber eyes blinking against the morning light. Weak, exhausted, but alert, she observed the scene around her. Her gaze fell on Asher, lingering just long enough for a silent acknowledgement to pass between them. There was no need for words. In that quiet cabin, a bridge of understanding had formed, one built on trust, patience, and the unspoken promise that her children were now safe. Asher's own body relaxed fractionally, though he remained close, ready for any sign of faltering. The moment was small, subtle, yet monumental. The danger of the night had passed, replaced by cautious hope. The mother's slight nod, the stirrings of the infants, and the soft light filtering through the windows combined into a single, quiet realization. Life had returned to the cabin. There was a moment of connection, unspoken yet profound, where human and creature, mother and children, shared the fragile warmth of survival together. The cabin, once cold and silent, now held the first quiet breaths of a new day. As the morning light spread through the trees beyond the cabin, movement caught Asher's eye at the edge of the forest. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, but slowly, figures emerged, tall, broad shapes moving with careful, deliberate steps among the trunks. They were other Bigfoots, silent and watchful, keeping their distance, yet clearly aware of what was happening inside the cabin. There was no sound from them, no growls, no footfalls that broke the soft crunch of snow under their weight. Their presence was calm, deliberate, unthreatening. It was as if they were waiting, observing, ensuring that nothing harmful was occurring to the mother or her young. Asher felt neither fear nor surprise, only a quiet recognition that he was witnessing something extraordinary and deeply respectful. The Mother Bigfoot stirred slightly at the window, her eyes following the figures with subtle awareness. She shifted her weight, raising her head just enough to sense them fully. A small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief passed from her as she relaxed fractionally, the tension of the night easing in response to the presence of her companions. The other Bigfoots remained still, patient, almost reverent. They did not approach hastily, did not demand attention. They simply waited, guardians at the edge of the forest, allowing the mother and her babies to recover before reuniting. Asher watched the scene quietly, understanding that he was an intruder, yet a necessary part of this fragile moment. The mother's trust in him had been complete, and now, with her family nearby once more, a silent balance was restored. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and for the first time since the night began, Asher felt the weight of relief settle slowly, quietly, into the cabin. By mid-morning, the Mother Bigfoot had gathered enough strength to rise, her massive frame moving with deliberate care. She cradled her 4 infants close to her chest, their tiny bodies pressed tightly against her for warmth and protection. Asher remained still, giving her space, watching quietly as she prepared to leave. There was no panic in her movements, no sudden haste, only the steady, determined rhythm of a mother reclaiming her children. Before stepping toward the forest edge, she turned her head slightly, amber eyes meeting Asher's for a brief, silent moment. In that glance, there was acknowledgement, gratitude, and trust. No words were spoken, no noises made. The cabin remained still, the fire crackling softly, as the mother and her babies began their slow, careful journey back toward the trees. Asher stood rooted, watching until the last shape disappeared among the trunks, carrying with it the quiet reminder of the fragile, extraordinary night they had all survived together. Once the mother and her infants had disappeared into the forest, the cabin seemed to exhale. Silence settled over the small space, broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire. The tension that had gripped the night was gone, leaving behind a calm so deep it felt almost tangible. Outside, the snow-marked footprints faded gradually under a light dusting from the wind, erasing every trace of their presence. It was as if the forest itself had reclaimed the moment, leaving only memory behind. Asher moved slowly through the cabin, checking the blankets, tending the fire one last time, but he said nothing to anyone. There would be no story told, no evidence left beyond what he remembered. This night belonged solely to him and the lives he had touched, a quiet testament to trust, survival, and the bond that had briefly bridged the divide between human and creature. He closed the cabin door, sat by the fire, and let the stillness settle around him, carrying the memory of that night quietly in his heart.